Hello everyone. We are here to decode the thought architecture, examining the diagnostic toolkit required to rigorously map the abstract territories of logic, psychology, the mind, epistemology, and language. Philosophy is absolutely not a historical artifact confined to dusty library shelves. It functions as the foundational cognitive operating system of human decision making. When we navigate complex problems in our daily lives, we are not merely reacting to external stimuli. We are actively running subroutines written in the profound code of philosophical inquiry. To truly master the architecture of human thought, we must systematically dissect the fundamental territories that govern our reasoning. We must begin with logic, which provides the uncompromising structural integrity of our arguments, ensuring that our conclusions genuinely and inevitably follow from our premises without error. Next, we analyze psychology, mapping the biological constraints and the necessary heuristic shortcuts that our evolutionary brains employ to survive in a rapidly changing, chaotic environment. We then delve deeply into the philosophy of mind, decoding the sheer mystery of subjective consciousness and the raw experience of physical reality itself. Epistemology serves as our rigorous anchor, answering the critical question of how we can reliably distinguish robust, verifiable knowledge from mere assumption or cognitive illusion. Finally, language acts as the ultimate operating interface, defining the exact boundaries of what we can successfully conceptualize and communicate to others. By integrating these five distinct domains into a cohesive diagnostic toolkit, we equip ourselves to dissect the hidden mechanics of human cognition. We elevate our daily choices from blind instinct to deliberate structural engineering, transforming how we perceive truth. Now, consider the phenomenon of cross-disciplinary synthesis. As human knowledge fractures into hyper-specialized domains, philosophy serves as the vital trade route, transferring structural insights across isolated intellectual borders. We live in an era where the natural sciences, psychology, the humanities, and daily life often operate in closed silos, speaking entirely different theoretical languages. The natural sciences examine the fundamental principles of existence and the measurable physical world. Yet, the scientific method itself relies entirely on foundational philosophical assumptions regarding causality, systematic observation, and the underlying uniformity of nature. Without philosophy acting as a merchant of ideas, science lacks the conceptual tools to justify its own observational methodology. Psychology investigates the human mind and behavior, mapping the empirical realities of how we actively think. However, it absolutely requires philosophy to provide the rigid conceptual definitions of consciousness, intentionality, and complex mental processes. Moving to the humanities, we explore human culture, history, and artistic expression. Here, philosophy provides the indispensable ethical frameworks and interpretative lenses required to make sense of our cultural evolution and our collective moral responsibilities. Philosophy actively bridges these disparate territories. It distills the empirical data of the sciences and the behavioral insights of psychology into cohesive logical structures, transporting them directly into the humanities to forge structural ethical meaning. Finally, this synthesis cascades into our daily life. It applies rigorous critical thinking to our everyday decisions, fostering a deep, necessary capacity for self reflection. When we face moral dilemmas or complex professional choices, we rely entirely on this interconnected network of disciplines, unified by philosophy, to pursue ethical choices and genuine meaning. To navigate the world effectively, we must master the hierarchy of truth, recognizing that human reasoning operates as a sophisticated, three-tiered engine. A flawless logical argument can still fail catastrophically if it operates on unexamined semantic ambiguity or contradicts observable empirical reality. We must surgically dissect this engine from the inside out. At the absolute core lies logical reasoning. This is the unbending structural skeleton of human thought. It operates on strict definitions, remaining mathematically rigid and entirely independent of subjective meaning. If premise A equals B and B equals C, then A inevitably equals C. This skeletal structure guarantees pure validity, but it remains utterly blind to the actual physical content of the external world. Surrounding this core is semantic reasoning, which acts as the flesh of language. Semantic reasoning is strictly bound by linguistic definitions, societal categories, and shared historical agreements. An argument might be logically valid, but if the words we use shift in meaning midway through the debate, the entire structure collapses into semantic nonsense. Semantic reasoning ensures our conceptual terms remain perfectly consistent throughout our analysis. Finally, encompassing both is empirical reasoning, representing the skin of reality. This outer protective layer is highly dependent on continuous observation, contextual nuances, and the measurable physical world. You can construct an argument that is perfectly logical in its skeleton and perfectly unambiguous in its semantic flesh. But if it fundamentally contradicts the empirical skin of reality, if your conclusion defies the observable laws of physics, your reasoning has completely failed. Mastery of thought requires the simultaneous calibration of all three complex tiers. Sound reasoning demands the rigorous alignment of terms, forcing us to navigate the strict boundary between logical form and fallacy. We must recognize that logical fallacies are not mere intellectual mistakes. They are structural defects intentionally introduced to bypass the heavy lifting of genuine, rigorous debate. Consider the syllogism blueprint, specifically the traditional Barbara syllogism format. This format demands absolute, uncompromising structural soundness. Premise 1 states that OM are P. Premise 2 establishes that OS are M. The inevitable mathematically secure conclusion is that OS are P. The conceptual terms align flawlessly like interlocking titanium gears, transferring absolute truth from the premises directly to the conclusion without losing an ounce of structural validity. But here is the catch. When intellectual rigor is maliciously abandoned, we frequently encounter the strawman fallacy, a format built entirely on deliberate cognitive distortion. The mechanism of this fallacy is both surgical and deceptive. First, a debater receives their opponent's incoming robust argument. Second, instead of engaging with the actual logic presented, they intentionally distort that precise argument into a fragile, inaccurate proxy, a caricature entirely stripped of its original nuance. Third, they ruthlessly destroy this weakened proxy, falsely claiming an intellectual victory they never actually earned. The end result of this structural defect is an absolute theoretical deadlock. The original argument remains untouched, while the audience is aggressively misled by the dramatic destruction of an illusion. To maintain the structural integrity of our argumentation, we must aggressively audit the alignment of our terms and reject deliberate distortion. The inherent limits of the mind force us to accept a profound rationality paradigm shift. Human cognition is not a flawed, omnipotent supercomputer. Rather, it is a highly adapted biological engine, specifically designed to make survival-level decisions under extreme time constraints. Historically, classical perfect rationality demanded an impossible standard for human performance. It assumed that our cognitive resources were truly infinite, allowing us to flawlessly process every conceivable variable in our environment. Because of this massive processing load, the speed of decision making was inherently slow, constantly aiming for an optimal, perfect accuracy goal. However, in the chaotic environment of reality, this model's real-world utility is dangerously low. Herbert Simon shattered this illusion by introducing bounded rationality. Simon accurately recognized that our cognitive resources and available energy are strictly limited. Therefore, our processing speed becomes moderate, and our accuracy goal shifts from absolute perfection to satisfying finding a solution that is simply good enough to successfully resolve the immediate problem. This vital shift yields remarkably high real-world utility. Yet, the paradigm shifts even further when we examine the frugal heuristics proposed by Gerd Gigerenzer. Gigerenzer demonstrated that in life or death scenarios, our assumed cognitive resources are practically scarce. The speed of decision making must be absolute and instant. The accuracy goal is no longer about optimal truth or even satisficing. It is purely about adaptive immediate survival. Frugal heuristics aggressively strip away complex computation, relying on rapid, intuitive rules of thumb that possess vital real-world utility. These cognitive shortcuts are evolutionary triumphs designed to keep us alive. While frugal heuristics ensure our immediate survival, we must aggressively confront the heavy cost of cognitive speed. The brain's survival shortcuts systematically distort logical reality by prioritizing easily accessible information and emotional framing over objective truth. These cognitive traps are the direct, unavoidable byproduct of our ancient evolutionary programming. Consider the availability heuristic. Our brains are bombarded with massive, endlessly complex datasets daily. To process this avalanche of data, the availability heuristic ruthlessly filters this information down to only the brightest, most recent, and most emotionally charged nodes in our memory. If a rare plane crash heavily dominates the news cycle, we irrationally perceive flying as highly dangerous, completely ignoring the massive statistical safety of modern aviation. We base our reality on what is immediately available, not what is statistically true. Next, examine the anchoring effect. When negotiating the price of a house or a car, a heavy initial anchor drags the median line of rational judgment far off center. If a seller throws out an initial exorbitant number, your subsequent counter-offers are unconsciously tethered to that artificial starting point, severely distorting your objective valuation of the asset. Finally, we face the framing effect. The exact same objective data point radically changes meaning based entirely on the constructed emotional container surrounding it. A financial investment presented with a 90% success rate is eagerly accepted within a game frame. Yet, the identical investment framed with a 10% failure rate within a loss frame triggers intense, irrational rejection. We must actively neutralize these inherent biological traps. We now turn to the persistent ghost in the machine, directly confronting the profound theoretical failure of Cartesian dualism. Treating the complex mind and the physical body as two entirely separate substances creates an insurmountable logical gap regarding exactly how they manage to interact. René Descartes fundamentally fractured human existence into two completely distinct realms. On one side, we have the physical or extended substance. This realm is entirely mechanical, strictly measurable, and absolutely bound by the inflexible laws of spatial physics and geometry. Your physical brain, your nervous system, and the physical chair you sit on exist entirely here. On the exact opposite side, Descartes proposed the mental or unextended substance. This realm is fully conscious, purely subjective, and utterly lacking in any physical dimension, mass, or location. Your private thoughts, your deepest memories, and your sense of identity reside in this ethereal domain. The fatal flaw of René Descartes' dualism emerges the precise moment a physical action follows a mental intention. If the mental substance lacks all physical properties, mass, and energy, it possesses no conceivable mechanism to push against the physical substance of your brain to raise your arm. It is a fundamental mechanical impossibility. You cannot use a non-physical ghost to manually turn the physical gears of a biological machine. Descartes' philosophical division isolates human consciousness into an inaccessible void, effectively paralyzing our rational understanding of human agency. To resolve this, modern philosophy had to abandon this strict separation and frantically search for cohesive, unified frameworks. To avoid the ultimate absurdity of continuous divine intervention, philosophy evolved aggressively toward physicalism, charting a highly complex mind-body diagnostic tree. We must determine exactly how mind and matter interact without breaking the laws of physics. Early philosophical attempts to fix Descartes' impossible gap were conceptually desperate. Nicolas Malebranche proposed Occasionalism, arguing that God must manually synchronize the mental intentions and the physical actions of every human being at every single moment. The structural flaw here is obvious. It relies entirely on unscientific, constant divine intervention. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz attempted a radically different fix with his theory of pre-established harmony. Leibniz argued that the mind and body are like two perfectly parallel, isolated clocks, wound up together at the dawn of time by a creator, ticking in perfect unison without ever physically touching. The fatal flaw is that this theory is overwhelmingly complex and completely dependent on a grand cosmic designer. Recognizing these immense logical failures, Baruch Spinoza advanced rapidly toward monism. Spinoza brilliantly fixed the dualist trap by proposing that the mind and the body are not separate entities at all, but rather two attributes of a single unified fundamental substance. They are two sides of the exact same reality. This critical conceptual pivot eventually laid the rigorous groundwork for modern physicalism. Physicalism completely eradicates the ghost. It asserts that all mental states strictly supervene on physical brain states. Every complex thought and emotional surge is fundamentally anchored in and generated by the electrochemical architecture of the human brain. Yet, modern physicalism collides violently with the barrier of qualia, exposing the absolute, unyielding limits of pure computation. Artificial intelligence can perfectly simulate complex syntax without ever achieving genuine subjective understanding or experiencing the raw, visceral sensation of reality. John Searle illustrates this beautifully with the Chinese room thought experiment. Imagine an isolated computer running a program perfectly translating Chinese syntax without possessing any actual understanding of the semantics. The machine processes the complex input flawlessly, matching symbols based on predetermined rules, and generates a perfect output. However, the warm orange glow of true human understanding is visibly and entirely absent. The system demonstrates pure syntax without semantics, resulting in absolutely zero subjective comprehension. It mimics human thought but internally experiences nothing. Frank Jackson pushes this conceptual boundary even further with Mary's room. Imagine Mary, a brilliant neuroscientist who knows every conceivable physical fact about color, optics, wavelengths, and neurobiology. Yet she has lived her entire life confined in a strictly black and white room. Her cognitive input consists of complete physical knowledge. When she finally steps outside that room and directly sees a red apple for the first time, she experiences the profound discovery of qualia, the subjective, raw, unquantifiable sensation of redness. According to Jackson, despite previously possessing all physical data, Mary learns something entirely new through direct subjective experience. These two experiments expose a devastating gap in computation. We can perfectly map the physics of the brain, but we cannot capture the visceral reality of conscious experience. Now, consider the complex mechanics of knowledge and how structural logic can accidentally synthesize a seemingly true conclusion from completely false and unrelated premises. Traditional philosophy, dating back to antiquity, confidently defined human knowledge as justified true belief. If you believe something, you have strong evidence for it, and it happens to be true, you supposedly possess knowledge. The Gettier problem places this ancient definition under intense destructive fire. Let us employ a surgical thought experiment using modern equivalents. Imagine input A. You firmly believe John has a brand new car because you saw him driving one today. It turns out this foundational premise is actually completely false. The car was merely a short-term rental. Now, imagine input B. You also hold a completely random, unverified belief that your colleague Smith is currently in Paris. You consider this irrelevant, but accidentally, Smith secretly flew to Paris this very morning. Now, your brain creates a logical disjunction using a standard OR gate. You conclude either John owns a new car or Smith is in Paris. Because a logical OR statement strictly requires only one half to be true, your final conclusion is synthetically true, resting completely on the accidental, lucky fact of Smith being in Paris. You formed a perfectly justified belief based on the visual evidence of John's car. The final conclusion happens to be mathematically true. You possess justified true belief. Yet, no rational human would claim you possessed actual knowledge because your correct conclusion was born from a catastrophic collision of a false premise and blind luck. To protect our rigorous pursuit of truth from the contamination of blind luck, we must carefully calibrate the burden of proof across the skepticism spectrum. Unbounded skepticism destroys our fundamental ability to function in reality, whereas healthy epistemology uses skepticism methodologically to separate robust, verifiable knowledge from mere cognitive assumption. At the far left of the spectrum lies the absolute void, historically defined by Gorgias. Gorgias argued that nothing exists. If it exists, it cannot be known, and if it is known, it cannot be communicated to others. This absolute nihilism paralyzes all cognitive action and renders any intellectual debate meaningless. Moving strategically toward the center, we encounter the methodological doubt of René Descartes. Descartes systematically doubted everything: his physical senses, his environment. His memory is not to permanently destroy knowledge, but to find a single, undeniable foundational truth. He stripped reality down to the absolute minimum until he reached the bedrock. I think, therefore I am. Descartes used extreme skepticism as a surgical tool to build objective knowledge back up. Finally, on the right, we reach bounded skepticism, articulated by modern thinkers like Hilary Putnam. Putnam addresses scenarios like the brain in a vat, exploring contextual truth versus absolute truth. Bounded skepticism acknowledges that while we cannot possess absolute, godlike certainty about the ultimate simulation of our physical reality, we can establish highly reliable, contextual truths within the parameters of our shared observable world. We must leverage Descartes' surgical doubt and Putnam's boundaries to construct a resilient framework. To firmly anchor this functional epistemology, we must rigorously navigate the triad of truth frameworks. Truth is not a single, immovable monolith. It is rigorously defined by how perfectly our internal mental maps align with physical reality, internal logic, or established societal norms. First, we critically examine the correspondence theory. This framework strictly requires matching physical reality. A belief is categorized as true if, and only if, it perfectly mirrors the external, observable physical world. If you state it is raining, that specific statement is true strictly if drops of water are physically falling from the sky. Second, we analyze the coherence theory, which strictly demands internal consistency. Under this framework, a belief is considered true if it logically integrates with our existing massive web of beliefs without generating a structural contradiction. For instance, mathematical systems or complex legal frameworks rely entirely on coherence. Truth is determined solely by the absence of internal conflict within the closed intellectual system. Third, we address the rectification of names, derived from ancient Confucian philosophy but universally applicable today as normative and historical consistency. Here, truth is inherently normative. It dictates that our actions and the realities we construct must strictly align with the historical, ethical definitions of their established titles. If a corporate leader does not act with the ethical responsibility historically demanded of true leadership, they fundamentally violate the truth of their title. By mastering correspondence, coherence, and normative consistency, we equip ourselves to evaluate facts and ethical constructs with supreme precision. To effectively process these multidimensional truths, we must rely on language as the ultimate operating interface, ruthlessly stripping away the persistent illusion of perfect mathematical definitions. Human language operates not through rigid, uncompromising dictionary definitions, but through complex, overlapping networks of contextual resemblance and deep historical usage. Ludwig Wittgenstein revolutionized this understanding with his profound concept of family resemblance. Traditionally, we falsely assume that all things falling under a single category share one essential defining core feature. Wittgenstein proved this assumption is a total illusion. Imagine node A, node B, and node C representing different concepts. Node A shares specific, identifiable traits with node B. Node B shares completely different traits with node C. Yet, node A and node C share absolutely nothing directly. Despite this lack of a universal core, They belong securely to the exact same linguistic family, bound together by a complex, overlapping web of similarities, much like the varied facial features mapped across multiple generations of a human family. Our words do not map onto reality with mathematical exactness. They are fluid tools heavily dependent on the specific context of the speaker and the listener. If we fail to grasp this fluidity, we fall into endless useless semantic disputes that stall intellectual progress. Ludwig Wittgenstein explicitly warned us of this profound limitation when he stated, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." Our cognitive boundaries and our fundamental capacity to conceptualize the universe are strictly confined by the architecture of our linguistic interface. This profound linguistic elasticity forces us to confront the underlying metaphysics of words. We must determine if categories actually exist. The intense debate over whether abstract categories physically exist dictates exactly how we organize data, structure human society, and judge individual human uniqueness. We must meticulously evaluate three distinct ontological frameworks. First, Platonic realism argues passionately for universals. This ancient theory claims that abstract categories, such as the perfect mathematical concept of a sphere or the absolute idea of justice, are actually more real and permanent than any physical instance. The physical world is merely a flawed, temporary shadow of these eternal, abstract categories. Second, nominalism violently rejects this entirely, arguing strictly for particulars. Nominalism asserts that only physical particulars actually exist this specific oak leaf, that specific vehicle. Abstract categories do not exist in physical reality. They are merely convenient vocal sounds, arbitrary labels we invent to group distinct objects together purely for cognitive efficiency and speed. Third, trope theory offers a highly sophisticated compromise. It suggests that reality consists solely of particularized properties. Instead of a universal concept of redness, trope theory argues for the specific, entirely unique redness of one specific apple, existing as a concrete property bound tightly to that exact space and time. Which conceptual framework we adopt radically alters our reality. If you are a nominalist, you treat every human being as an absolute singularity. Our metaphysical stance programs the very logic by which we categorize existence. The philosophy of practical decision making heavily requires the deliberate cultivation of the integrated thinker. Absolute mastery of thought requires recognizing that language frames reality. Our biology limits processing. Strict logic prevents fatal errors, and epistemology securely anchors us to the truth. To achieve this, we must execute a relentless five-step cognitive cycle. Step 1. Language frames the absolute boundary of the problem. If we mislabel the crisis using inaccurate words, our entire diagnostic process collapses before it even begins. Step 2. The mind experiences the subjective context. We must account for the visceral, unquantifiable qualia that deeply drive human motivation. Step 3. Psychological heuristics continuously propose rapid, intuitive solutions. We utilize these biological shortcuts for necessary speed, but we must instantly audit them to neutralize inherent cognitive biases. Step 4. Logic relentlessly catches heuristic fallacies and structural flaws, ensuring our rapid assumptions do not violate the unbending rules of validity. Step 5. Epistemology verifies the final output as true knowledge, demanding rigorous justification before we commit to any definitive action. This cycle is not merely an academic exercise, it is an absolute survival necessity. As we hurtle deeper into the AI era, where artificial systems can perfectly simulate syntax and vastly outpace human computation, our only remaining advantage is our complex philosophical architecture. Algorithms merely process data. Humans must process meaning, complex ethics, and ultimate truth. By mastering these interconnected philosophical disciplines, we elevate ourselves to integrated architects. Thank you. See you next time.